Well, I thought I'd describe a great trick that I use all the time for transferring sketches to another sheet of paper. Do you ever have issues with background washes of your watercolors going in poorly because the paper was damaged by erasing? Or maybe having some of your graphite sketch show up in your finished paintings? Hot press watercolor paper sometimes takes washes a little unevenly. So sometimes if you've been sketching on the paper and you erase the lines to remove the graphite, those lines still show up in your washes. Now, if you're interested in super loose watercolors where the sketch and your pencil lines and other elements are part of the fun and the charm of your work, then this transfer trick may be an unnecessary step for you. I still use it to protect the paper even if I'm doing loose watercolors, well, at least loose by my standards. I'm coming at this from a watercolor painting angle, but I first learned this trick when I was doing pen and ink work on scratchboard. I had never seen it done when I was an undergrad in art school. I came across this technique when one of my grad school profs was asking another student in my class why she was sketching and erasing the life out of her good illustration board. He ended up calling us all over and showing us this trick. I think I've used it on just about every piece since then. He encouraged us to sketch and problem solve anywhere but on our finished surface. Well, that makes sense to me. Watercolor can be a fussy medium, and hot press paper can be especially delicate and easily damaged for background washes. Well, there are some disadvantages to this. It's definitely slower, and there are more steps involved in sketching right on your paper. And you'll need a few supplies, but it's likely that you already have them. Keep in mind that your transfers are mirror images, so you may want to flip your image on the computer to match your reference photos. Now for the advantages. Doing a sketch transfer keeps your paper in pristine condition, and it protects it from any erasing damage or stray lines that you don't need. The transferred lines are super clean and they're crisp. You can do all of your drawing and problem solving on another piece of paper. Like woodworkers always say, measure twice and cut once. You can choose to transfer in stages, like doing the background first and then the detail for the foreground later. This is handy if you're using liquid Frisket. It likes to lift off your graphite sketch. Now you can add your foreground sketch lines after you peel the Frisket off. Not that we anticipate mistakes, but if you do need, you can use a transfer sheet a few times if you end up messing up your first wash. In the end, your final sketches are almost invisible in the final paintings. So what do you need? Well, not that much, and it's likely that you already have most of the supplies. First, you need tracing paper. I always have this handy for making corrections to sketches and experimenting in my sketchbooks. For transferring the thicker and clearer, more expensive tracing papers, those tend to work best. You don't want the floppy, super thin stuff. Vellum is really good. It's fantastic. I always use hard pencils when making my transfers. I use a 5H. You may be able to get away with a softer pencil lead. The harder pencil leads transfer more cleanly, and they're much less likely to smudge than, say, a number 2. You'll want some artist tape to hold down your tracing paper to your sketch and attach it to your watercolor paper when you're transferring it. And you'll need a folding bone. The edge of an old spoon works great too, and you probably already have one of those. So how do you do it? Well, first I flip the sketch on the computer and I print it out so it isn't a mirror image in the final transfer. And then tape your tracing paper down at the corners so the tracing paper is held really tight. I use 5H graphite leads in a lead holder. Harder pencils transfer cleaner and they stay sharp. I trace only the main lines of my sketch on a hard surface like a Formica tabletop. The harder surface, that allows me to transfer a lot of the graphite to the tracing paper. I also sharpen my pencil really frequently to keep the lines as even and as dark as possible. When making my transfer, I work from one side of the tracing paper to the other to keep from smudging the graphite. As I get towards the end of the tracing process, I flip up a corner of the tracing paper and compare it to the base sketch, and then I make sure that I got all those details. In the end, I have a great transfer on my tracing paper ready to put on my good paper. Now that the tracing is over, it's time to transfer. I'm usually using a watercolor block, but this works on any reasonably hard, light-colored surface. I've used this technique on an illustration board, scratch board, pastel paper. I've even done it on gessoed masonite for acrylics. I carefully tape the tracing paper graphite side down as tight as possible because the tracing paper tends to loosen up and stretch a little bit as you go through the transfer process. If I'm going to be using liquid frisket to mask off my painting, I skip transferring the sketch where the frisket will go for now. When the frisket gets removed, it likes to peel up the transferred lines, well, at least partially. So I will do those areas that are going to be under the frisket, I'll transfer those later. I'll use a folding bone to burnish the opposite side of the tracing paper, and this transfers some of the graphite over to the watercolor paper. An important note, I find it helpful to stretch the paper a little bit when I'm rubbing it to keep it super taut. This keeps the lines from getting blurry if the tracing paper starts to stretch out a little bit from all the rubbing. And the better your tracing paper, the less this is a problem. I periodically peel up a corner of the tape and I check the transfer to make sure that it's even and clean and that I got all the details, and then I tape it back down tightly. And typically I work from one side of the page to the other. After a few double checks, I'll remove the tracing paper and set it aside in case I need it again, either for transferring the detail areas that I'll add in after removing the frisket, or just in case I mess up the entire background and need to start over. With good tracing paper, you can usually get 2 to 3 good transfers, and sometimes I'll use a kneaded eraser to lift the lines if they're a bit darker than I need. Like if it's going to be a light color that's mostly white or yellow, sometimes those transferred lines show up more. So sometimes I lighten those up a bit with the kneaded eraser. And as you can see from these examples, in finished paintings, the lines are pretty much invisible. Well, that's all there is to it. It's pretty quick to get a hang of it, and it's worth the extra time to go through the process, especially if you're doing detailed watercolors. Give it a try and see what you think.